Blood and power, these were the things that ruled Henry VIII's life. But by the winter of 1547, England's most feared king was trapped by something worse than any enemy, his own dying body. The king was fading, yet still fought to hold on to his power. Before we dive deep into the story, subscribe to the channel so you never miss powerful and thought-provoking stories. Let's go in deep. Henry VIII was once a strong, handsome young king. He was full of energy, a symbol of power and health. He was the perfect prince, loved by many. But over time, he changed. The man who once jousted and danced with ease now struggled with his own body. His once athletic figure became bloated and sickly, trapped by the pain of his own failing health. As he grew older, Henry's reign turned darker. He was no longer the charming king who won the hearts of his people. His marriages, brutal executions, and harsh rule showed a side of him few could have imagined. He destroyed those who challenged him, from wives to noblemen, all in the name of power. His body, once strong and full of life, had become a prison of suffering. The king who had once ruled with force was now helpless against the toll his own ambition had taken on him. His body had betrayed him, showing the true cost of his quest for control. What was once a symbol of strength had now become a symbol of decay. As the years passed, Henry's once strong and healthy body began to betray him. At first, the changes were small, aches and pains that seemed like nothing more than signs of age. But soon those small problems turned into something much worse. His legs began to swell, and painful ulcers started to appear on his flesh. These wounds were deep, raw, and infected, causing him excruciating pain every day. They would ooze foul-smelling fluids, and the stench was so bad that even the people closest to him could barely stand to be near him. Despite his size, his body had become weak and fragile, trapped in a slow decline that no one could stop. At the time, there was little doctors could do. Henry's physicians tried everything they could think of. They bled him, believing that removing his blood would cure him of his sickness. They used herbal remedies, hoping the plants would heal his wounds. They even prayed, hoping divine intervention would save him. But nothing worked. Each new treatment only brought more suffering, and Henry's body only grew weaker. The treatments were not only ineffective but often left him in more pain, making him feel like a prisoner in his own skin. What made the pain even worse was the mental toll his illness took on him. The once confident, powerful king, who had once jousted with the finest knights in Christendom, now found himself unable to walk without help. He was confined to his chambers, unable to move freely, relying on mechanical devices to shift his massive body. This was not the man who had once led armies to victory. The king who had once ruled with absolute power now spent his days in agony, unable to do anything about it. The pain weighed on his mind just as heavily as it weighed on his body. With each passing day, his mind grew darker. His mood swings became more violent. One moment he would be angry and shouting, the next he would fall into long periods of silence, unable to do anything but stare into the distance. His paranoia increased. He became fixated on the idea that others were plotting against him. Those around him, his advisors, his court, began to see the king they once admired as a broken man, filled with fear and bitterness. The physical pain and the emotional turmoil twisted him into someone almost unrecognizable. The young king who had once been full of life was now confined to a bed, weakened and frail. His body, once a symbol of power and strength, had become his enemy, and no matter how much he tried, there was nothing he could do to stop it. As Henry VIII's health rapidly declined, the world around him seemed to spin faster. Despite his failing body, the political world in England never slowed. If anything, it became more intense. In the final years of his life, Henry's influence was still felt in every decision that came from his court. But it wasn't just his health that was crumbling, his empire was beginning to fracture. With his son Edward VI positioned to take the throne, the factions in his court were beginning to fight for control over the young king, even before his father had passed. The Catholic conservatives, led by figures like the Duke of Norfolk, and the Protestant reformers, including Henry's own trusted advisor Edward Seymour, were at odds, each side working behind the scenes to secure the future of England and ensure that their beliefs would dominate after Henry's death. The court was divided between those loyal to Henry's religious legacy and those who wanted to push further toward Protestantism, a shift Henry had started but had never fully embraced. In his final days, Henry's health was deteriorating to the point where he could barely speak, let alone make decisions. Yet, despite this, he held on to one thing that had always defined him: control. The king, obsessed with the future of his dynasty, continued to use his dwindling power to issue orders. He signed execution orders, decreed new laws, and sought to establish the path of succession with a firm hand. It was clear that he was trying to secure his legacy, not just through his son, but through the structures he had built. But the king was no longer able to do these things with the force he once had. His decrees, though signed with his name, carried the weight of a dying man, his body too weak to carry out his will. Yet Henry was keenly aware of the power struggle happening around him. He knew his enemies were watching, waiting for him to fall. The whispers in the corridors of the palace spoke of who would control England after his death, and he would not let anyone take that power from him without a fight. His paranoia grew, and he became fixated on ensuring that no one took advantage of his vulnerability. Even as his body failed him, his mind remained sharp in certain areas, especially when it came to political maneuvering. The king knew the game was being played, and he did everything he could, despite his physical condition, to stay one step ahead. One of the most striking elements of this period was the secrecy that surrounded Henry's health. The truth of his illness was hidden from the public. Courtiers and advisors were sworn to silence, and the royal physicians were instructed not to speak of the king's failing health. The court maintained a careful illusion that Henry was still strong, still in control, his health was downplayed, and the image of a vibrant king was kept alive as long as possible. This secrecy served a double purpose: to maintain the respect of the court and the nation, and to buy time for Henry's heirs to secure their place. Behind the scenes, those who had the king's ear worked tirelessly to protect their interests, while the king himself remained a ghost in his own court. His mind remained active, his grip on power a mere shadow of what it once had been. As he faced his final days, Henry's legacy was already in motion. The political games played in his court were no longer about his reign, they were about the future of England, and even as his body rotted away, Henry remained determined to ensure that his vision for the country would be carried out, regardless of who would eventually take his place. In these final moments, the king's paranoia and obsession with control were clear signs of how deeply the fear of losing his empire had gripped him. The strength he had once commanded was gone, but his will to dominate the political landscape remained as strong as ever. The dying king, trapped in his decaying body, was still the centre of a court fighting for the future of England. The struggle for power, for control, was as fierce as ever, and Henry would not allow anyone to forget that, even in death. As Henry's final days drew near, the once mighty king was now reduced to a shadow of the man he had been. His body had become a prison, and the pain that gripped him never let go. The cold, dark halls of Whitehall Palace echoed with his suffering. His body was swollen beyond recognition, and his legs were covered in painful ulcers that oozed with infection. The stench of decay filled the air, a constant reminder of the king's slow and steady decline. His once strong body, once full of life and strength, now betrayed him, rotting from the inside out. The room around him was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn to block out the light. The smell of incense filled the air, but it could not cover the overpowering odour of sickness. Henry's physicians tried everything they could think of to ease his pain, but nothing worked. Opium was constantly given to him to dull the agony, but even that couldn't stop the deep suffering. His body had begun to fail in ways that even the best doctors couldn't fix. Every breath was laboured, and every movement caused pain. He could barely move at all, trapped in his bed, surrounded by the reminders of his former power. But it wasn't just the physical pain that tormented Henry. His mind was just as broken as his body. Night after night, he was haunted by nightmares, waking in fear and confusion. His dreams were filled with the faces of the people he had wronged, the wives he had executed, the noblemen he had betrayed, and the countless enemies who had fallen because of him. They all seemed to return to him in his sleep, standing at the foot of his bed, silent and accusing. He saw the ghosts of his past, and they filled him with dread. During moments when he wasn't lost in his dreams, Henry's mind would shift back to reality, but it wasn't much better. His temper, once so fierce and terrifying, was now erratic. One moment he would scream at his servants, cursing them for their failure to save him, and the next he would fall silent, staring off into space as if he were lost in another world. His once powerful voice, which had commanded armies and forced people to bend to his will, was now weak and trembling. The king who had once controlled everything around him was now helpless, unable to even control his own body or mind. The walls of his palace, once filled with his voice and laughter, now echoed with his cries of pain and confusion. Henry's body continued to swell, his legs covered with sores and ulcers that refused to heal. These were not just simple wounds, they were reminders of the king's decline, a sign of his failing health that only grew worse as time passed. His skin had taken on a sickly yellow tint, and his once sharp eyes had become dull and sunken. The power he had once held in his eyes was gone, replaced by the vacant look of someone who had lost everything. He had once been the greatest king in Europe, but now he was reduced to a man who could no longer even stand on his own 2 feet. But amidst all the pain, there were moments when Henry's vulnerability broke through. In the quiet moments, when the pain eased just a little, he would cry out for forgiveness. His voice, once loud and commanding, was now soft and full of fear. He begged for mercy from God, knowing that he would soon face the judgment for all the lives he had taken and the suffering he'd caused. His faith, once a tool of power, now became a source of deep anxiety. He struggled with the religious decisions he had made throughout his life, his break from the Catholic Church, his creation of the Church of England, and his violent attacks on those who opposed him. He had once been so sure of his place in the world, but now, as death approached, he was unsure of his standing before God. In his final days, Henry's mind and body were at war with each other. His Protestant reforms, which he had fought for so fiercely, now seemed to haunt him, as if the very decisions he had made had led him down this painful road. He had once been certain of his beliefs, but now, as he lay dying, he seemed torn between the old ways of the Catholic Church and the new path he had set for England. This internal struggle weighed heavily on him, adding to the chaos inside his mind. He was no longer the man who had stood as the head of the Church of England. He was simply a man, lying on his deathbed, wondering if his soul would ever find peace. His final moments were marked by this constant battle, his body broken and decaying and his mind full of regret and fear. He had once ruled with absolute power, but now he was at the mercy of his own body, helpless and frail. The king who had once commanded armies and made history was now nothing more than a man, struggling against the inevitable end. In the quiet moments before his death, as the last of his strength faded away, Henry faced the reality of his own mortality, something no amount of power could protect him from. In the final days of his life, Henry VIII's body, once a powerful symbol of unshakable strength, betrayed him in the most violent way. On a cold, dark evening, a seizure gripped the king, shaking him violently in his bed. His massive frame convulsed uncontrollably, as if his very essence was fighting against the inevitable. The shockwave of this attack rippled through Whitehall Palace, affecting not just the king, but everyone who watched in horror. His attendants, courtiers, and physicians were all powerless in the face of his sudden collapse. As Henry writhed in pain, his physicians scrambled in desperation, attempting to save him with every treatment they could think of. They had failed him time and again, but this time was different. This was a matter of life and death. They applied hot irons to his skin, hoping to revive him by forcing warmth into his frozen body. The searing heat, meant to shock his system into action, only made the king's suffering worse. His body twitched and shuddered with each agonizing touch. It was a desperate act, an attempt to prevent the inevitable, but nothing could stop the slow unravelling of the once mighty monarch. Alongside the hot irons, the physicians pushed bitter medicinal concoctions down Henry's throat, hoping that some miracle would save him. The potions they gave him tasted of herbs and unpleasant mixtures, each more vile than the last. The king, whose very word had once meant life or death for anyone in his kingdom, was now at the mercy of his own failing body. The men who had sworn to heal him now watched in helplessness as their most powerful patient slipped further away. The courtiers who had once feared the king's wrath stood in stunned silence. They had seen Henry at his strongest, commanding respect with a single glance. Now they watched as the king they once admired, now a bloated, sickly figure, struggled to hold on to life. The emotional toll on those who had served him for years was immense. Some whispered prayers, while others simply stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. For many, the sight of the once indomitable king, now reduced to a pitiful, suffering man, was a stark reminder of their own vulnerability. No one was immune to death, not even the mighty king who had reshaped England with his will. Amidst the chaos, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, worked tirelessly to control the flow of information. He knew that the king's condition could not be allowed to spread beyond the walls of Whitehall. Word of Henry's deteriorating health could spark instability within the court, and worse, it could lead to an uprising or foreign invasion. The fragile power structure of England relied on the king's presence, and with his decline, the very future of the country seemed uncertain. Cranmer, always the politician, understood the importance of maintaining control. He insisted that only a select few be allowed into Henry's room, ensuring that no rumours leaked out to the public. The court's secrecy surrounding Henry's health was essential in keeping the kingdom from falling into chaos. But even as the political wheels turned behind the scenes, Henry's own mind was a battleground. The terror of what lay beyond death seemed to grip him more tightly with each passing hour. The king, who had once ruled with brutal authority, was now terrified of facing the judgment of God. His heart, once full of arrogance and confidence, now beat with fear. He had lived a life of violence, deceit, and betrayal, and the thought of standing before God, who would judge him for all his sins, filled him with dread. In his final moments, Henry clung to his faith with a desperation that mirrored his physical struggle. His once firm belief in his own power had crumbled, and now he was left to face the consequences of his reign. The man who had executed wives, murdered enemies, and altered the course of history through sheer force of will was now reduced to a trembling figure, consumed by fear and regret. He had once believed himself invincible, but now he was nothing more than a dying man fearing the judgment that awaited him. As the seizure subsided and Henry lay still, gasping for breath, the reality of his mortality became undeniable. His reign, once marked by strength and cruelty, was ending in weakness and fear. In the silence of that room, amidst the frantic efforts to save him, one truth became clear. No amount of power could shield him from the inevitable. The man who had once stood above all others, unchallenged in his authority, now lay at the mercy of death. And in that final moment, Henry VIII, the king who had shaped England's destiny, was as helpless as the humblest of his subjects. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII, the king who had ruled England with relentless force, took his final breath. The body that had once commanded armies and executed with a mere word finally gave in to the diseases and wounds that had slowly consumed it. His enormous form, once full of life, was now a lifeless shell. The pain, the suffering, and the weight of his past had all led to this inevitable end. The great monarch, who had shaped England in his image, was gone. In the moments following his death, the world around him grew eerily quiet. The chamber where Henry had spent his final days, filled with the scent of decay and the shadow of his suffering, was now empty. The courtiers who had once feared him, who had trembled at the sound of his voice, now stood in the silence of his passing, unsure of what to do. His death marked the end of an era defined by his brutal rule, his endless thirst for power, and his relentless pursuit of control. And now the king who had shaped his world with such force was no more. As his body lay still, there was a quiet dignity in his final moments. Despite all the cruelty and violence of his reign, there was something human in the way he faced death. In the hours leading up to his passing, Henry had briefly turned his thoughts to his faith. Though his beliefs had shifted throughout his life, it seemed that in his final moments, he sought comfort in the idea of forgiveness. His chaplain, present at his side, noted how Henry had expressed fear of judgment and asked for peace. This brief moment of spiritual reckoning was a far cry from the powerful and unyielding king who had once torn apart the Catholic Church and declared himself its head. Now the same king was seeking solace, perhaps hoping for redemption. The contrast between Henry's once imposing presence and the lifeless body that now lay in front of them was striking. The man who had filled rooms with his commanding stature and fiery temper was now just another body. His death left behind an empty throne, an empty symbol of the power he had once wielded. For all his strength, for all the fear and awe he had commanded in life, death had stripped him of everything. The throne, once a seat of unimaginable power, was now waiting for his young son, Edward VI, to take it. But it was no longer Henry who sat in it. It was the future, uncertain and fragile, and the power he had so carefully held onto was now in the hands of others. As his courtiers whispered among themselves, there was no longer the fear of his wrath, but an uncertain future that loomed before them. His death brought an end to the tyranny that had marked his reign, but it also left behind a kingdom in turmoil filled with factions fighting for control. The king who had once been the heart of England, commanding life and death with a word, was gone, and in his place there was only silence, an empty throne, a nation unsure of what was to come next. After Henry VIII's death on January 28, 1547, an unsettling silence descended upon Whitehall Palace. His passing was kept secret for 3 full days, a carefully orchestrated delay orchestrated by his trusted advisers to ensure a smooth transition of power. The courtiers, still in shock from the loss of their king, were sworn to silence. No one was to speak of the death outside the royal household, as the advisers scrambled behind the scenes to control the kingdom's future. The secrecy was essential. With the king gone, the political landscape of England was on the edge of collapse. At the centre of this was Edward Seymour, the uncle of Henry's young son, Edward VI. Seymour quickly recognised the opportunity and moved decisively to secure his position as Lord Protector of the realm. While the young king, Edward VI, was the rightful heir, his age made him incapable of ruling alone. Seymour's calculated actions ensured that he would be the one to control the reins of power until Edward was old enough to take the throne. The first critical step was ensuring the secrecy of Henry's death. If the news had spread too soon, it could have triggered a power struggle. The conservative Catholic factions in the court, led by the Duke of Norfolk, would have likely sought to assert control, while the Protestant factions, including Seymour, aimed to guide the kingdom in a more reformist direction. If the details of Henry's passing had leaked, there would have been chaos, unrest both in the court and among the general population. The political manoeuvring that followed Henry's death was swift and ruthless. Behind the scenes, key figures worked to position themselves, manipulating events to ensure their own survival in the new regime. Edward Seymour, through careful alliances and quick action, seized control, locking down the power structures to ensure that he, not any other faction, would hold sway over the future of England. This conspiracy of silence and political manipulation stood in stark contrast to the image of royal dignity Henry had once projected. The king, in his later years, had sought to control everything, from his health to his kingdom's religious direction, through force. But now, in death, he was removed from the drama of court politics. The king who had once been at the centre of every decision, every power play, was gone, and yet the game for control of England continued, proving that even in death, the monarchy's image could be manipulated to suit the ambitions of the living. Henry VIII's death did not bring the peace he might have imagined. Instead, it set the stage for a period of intense turmoil and conflict that would shake England for decades to come. His reign, marked by ruthless decisions, brutal executions, and religious upheaval, left behind a kingdom divided. His passing triggered a series of struggles over the future direction of the country, political and religious battles that would continue to unfold long after his death. At the time of Henry's death, his son, Edward VI, was just a child barely 9 years old. This left the kingdom vulnerable, and power quickly shifted to the hands of those who could control the boy king. Edward's short reign, guided by the ambitious Edward Seymour, marked a shift toward Protestantism. Henry's early break with the Catholic Church, though incomplete, had set the stage for a religious transformation in England. However, Edward's reign was brief, and the power of the Protestant cause was still fragile. When Edward VI died in 1553, it was his sister Mary I who claimed the throne. Mary, a devout Catholic, sought to restore Catholicism in England. Her reign was marked by fierce religious persecution. She earned the nickname Bloody Mary for her brutal actions against Protestants. Mary's attempt to undo the religious changes Henry had set in motion only intensified the divisions within the kingdom. The country once again found itself torn between two faiths, Catholicism and Protestantism, and Mary's reign left scars that would not easily heal. The story didn't end there, though. After Mary's death, her half-sister Elizabeth I ascended the throne. Elizabeth, a Protestant, firmly consolidated the Protestant faith as England's state religion. Her reign marked the beginning of the Elizabethan era, an age of prosperity, cultural flourishing, and religious stability. Yet even under Elizabeth, Henry's legacy remained a topic of fierce debate. Was he a defender of the faith or a tyrant who divided the kingdom? His break with Rome, his creation of the Church of England, and his constant battle with the papacy left England in a perpetual state of religious tension. Each of his children in their time had to grapple with this divided legacy. What makes Henry's legacy so tragically ironic is that, in his attempt to control the future of his kingdom and religion, he set in motion the very religious and political struggles he had hoped to avoid. His aggressive actions, executing his wives, severing ties with Rome, and forcing religious change upon the people, created a legacy of division, violence, and uncertainty. The political instability that followed his death, with successive monarchs undoing and reinstating his reforms, highlighted the lasting power of his decisions. In the end, Henry VIII's death did not end his influence. It merely opened the door for the very chaos he had tried to control. His children, each with their own vision for England, would struggle to find a way to move beyond the legacy of their father. The nation Henry had shaped with such force would spend years recovering from the wounds his reign had inflicted. In the end, Henry VIII was a man caught between the myth of his power and the reality of his decline. The ruthless monarch who once held the fate of a nation in his hands became a prisoner of his own body, struggling against forces he could not control. His life and death remind us of the fleeting nature of human dominance and the inevitable march of mortality. So, who was Henry VIII truly? A king who reshaped England, or a man consumed by his own ambition and fear? Like, subscribe to our channel Nailed History, and stay tuned for more powerful stories that challenge the way we see history.